Hey, if you're a Black Sabbath fan or you're somebody that enjoys the history of Black Sabbath and kind of the chaos part of it, I think you're going to have a lot of fun with this video. I found something really, really unique. I found a newspaper article. It was kind of an interview done. It was about Black Sabbath in the period between Ozzy leaving and Dio joining and while Geezer was gone. Because what's I think maybe forgotten, I know by me sometimes when I'm thinking about these things, is Geezer actually left the band during that period too. There was a time after Ozzy left when it was only Tony Iommi and Bill Ward for a little period of time. It was just the two of them wondering, what are we going to do? And this article is during that time. So it's kind of fascinating reading this. So I'm going to share this with you because it's so cool. This is from September 10th, 1979. And so remember, Never Say Die came out basically about a year earlier from this. It came out in September of 78. And that was the last time we would see Ozzy for a long, long, long time. You know, then of course he went off and started his own thing. And then he left, you know, then Black Sabbath thinking, what are we going to do now? And then they get introduced to Ronnie James Dio. And then they think, rather than starting a new band, they think we're just going to take the Black Sabbath name and continue on. And then it was the following year after this, actually, what would have been about 7-8 months later after this article is written, that Heaven and Hell came out, the first album with Black Sabbath featuring Ronnie James Dio as the singer. So anyway, I think you're going to get a kick out of this. The title is Sabbath Days ... And at the top of it, it says Heavyweights Break Up, Revivalists Break Records. And that's kind of everything that's on this page. So we're just going to read the Heavyweights Break Up part, which is the Black Sabbath part. Okay. In 10 years, Black Sabbath have become one of the world's greatest exponents of heavyweight rock, second only in fame and fortune perhaps to Led Zeppelin. Now hastily repaired after their latest and most divisive split, the story of the four Birmingham lads that made millions out of making Sabbath great is one of rags to riches and triumph, punctuated with wrangles and occasional disasters. The four came from the back streets of Erdington, Aston, and King's Standing and went to school together. Their names are bywords to fans who buy their albums by the million. Vocalist Ozzy Osbourne, lead guitarist and driving musical force behind the band, Tony Iommi, guitarist, Geezer Butler, and so they kind of mess this up a little bit because they say the guitarist is Geezer Butler when it's actually, of course, you know, the bass guitarist, and drummer extraordinaire Bill Ward. Ozzy once summed up their plight when they left school. Quote, I was a dropout at school. I didn't pass any exams. I got a job like everybody else. And until we formed the band, my whole world was the town I lived in. As soon as you join a band, you realize how big the world is, unquote. The juvenile Sab played wherever pubs and clubs would have them for peanuts. And it's always interesting. I know we talked about this before, but you always have to put the time in context here, because even though this was the late 60s, early 70s, England was still recovering from World War II. The country was ravaged during that period. And so a lot of these young guys like Ozzy, that next generation, they grew up in these factory towns that were still recovering from World War II, and there was a great deal of poverty. And you hear stories about Ozzy that as a teenager, they say that when he showed up, I think it was showed up to the first rehearsal or something with the band, he didn't even have his own pair of shoes. So they were destitute back then. And so when he says he got a job like everybody else, it's important to note that, because when you grew up in that world, your future was, I'm going to go into a factory and I'm going to spend the rest of my life working in a factory. And of course, the story of Tony Iommi is one of finding himself in a factory. And then that's, of course, where he got his injury on his hand. But anyway, I don't mean to beat that to death, but it's always kind of important just to put this in context the world in the late 60s and early 70s, especially in England, is very far removed from the world that I live in, for sure, in southern Utah in the United States. Okay, then in 1968, they joined the latest In Scene for Sounds in Birmingham, Henry's Blues House, a teenage club opened by rising city impresario Jim Simpson, who was managing and marketing groups on his Big Bear record label in Edgbaston. I don't know how you say that. Simpson discovered them. They played at the club from time to time and eventually became their manager and set them on the road to fame via the Continental Circuit. Having reached the point where they were just about to break into the big time in 1970, the four Sabs were whisked away by two rival manager agents. Simpson sued for breach of contract and enticement on the part of the new managers. 6 years later, he won agreed damages of £35,000 in an out-of-court settlement. During that 6 years, it was estimated that Black Sabbath had earned £7 million from record sales. Then and since, they established a massive following in the USA with record-breaking crowds at their concerts. They cut what are regarded among the heavy mob as a whole batch of classic rock records, though never really receiving a great deal of critical acclaim. Yeah, and actually some of the other videos we've shared on this channel where we read some of the critical reviews of records. I mean, it's true, they didn't get a lot of critical acclaim. But they created some of the most iconic, as it says there, the heavy mob, some of the most iconic heavy songs ever made. And anyway, I love that early stuff. Stuff like Paranoid, War Pigs, Children of the Grave, Dirty Women, and they toured the world. By the way, how do you beat the song War Pigs? I got to tell you, that probably, if I had to say, that probably has to be maybe the best Black Sabbath song ever. And what's really interesting, since they mentioned that song, and Sabbath fans would probably already know this, but the album Paranoid was supposed to be called War Pigs. Paranoid was an afterthought song because they needed one more song on the album. It turned out so good that, of course, even today, it's kind of a touchstone for Black Sabbath. It's one of their key songs, even though they threw it together at the last minute. They named the album Paranoid, which then made the cover make no sense because the cover of the album was made for the title War Pigs. They renamed it Paranoid, and now it made absolutely no sense at all. And I got it. I'm going to share my opinion here for a second. Black Sabbath's first album, Black Sabbath, of course, may be one of the most iconic, amazing album covers ever created, ever. And to follow it up with that kind of what I think was kind of a sloppy album cover, and that even the carelessness in the naming by the time they got to that point is kind of a shame. Because I don't know, I think the cover is kind of silly. I don't think there's much to it at all. They've got a couple of really cool covers, Black Sabbath does, and a couple that are really terrible. And to me, Paranoid's like, especially after that first album. That cover was so great. It was so great. To have Paranoid be so kind of meh. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off on that, but throw into my personal thoughts there. But here we go, next thing. But always, it was home to the Midlands after record-cutting sessions and exhausting tours. By the spring of 1977, their accountants were begging them to leave Britain and become tax exiles. They considered it seriously. But they decided that they just couldn't leave their various homes, mansions now, and spread out over the Midlands for exile abroad. As Bill Ward put it, quote, "To tell you the truth, we're glad we can go unrecognized in this country. There's nothing I like better than a game of darts and a pint in our local at Aston." So they stayed. But they had their ups and downs, and rumors of Ozzy's disaffection and impending departure from the group were mounting. At the end of 1977, he made the break and quit. In as replacement came Walsall-born ex-Fleetwood Mac singer Dave Walker. Suddenly rocketed to rock stardom. It was short-lived. Within a matter of weeks, Ozzy was back. as loud and raucous as ever. And to celebrate their 10 years together, Sab came back to their native Brum for 2 nights of celebration with other local fans at the Odeon New Street in June of 1978. The first night was a flop because their amplifiers failed. The second was one of the loudest, most ecstatic birthday parties in history, and they came back later to fulfill the postponed first night. Their success story continued. Then this year, on the west coast of California, things started going seriously wrong. The ever extrovert Ozzy walked out in July because he didn't agree with the direction which the band's music was going. Geezer Butler later followed him, walking out in the middle of a recording of a new album in California, and hopped on the first plane home. He has not been seen since. Remember what I said, how this article was in that limbo period in between? Yeah. Ozzy is now looking for a new backing group, and the 2 original Sabs, Tony Iommi and Bill Ward, have now been joined by singer Ronnie Dio of Rainbow and Jeff Nickel, formerly guitarist with the Birmingham band Quartz. Whither Sabbath now? Dio and Iommi are experimenting with more subtle, supernatural stuff than the basic explosion of noise they have always been famous for. Whether it works will depend to a great extent on the dedication of the fans who have carried them to the top. And then they have a picture of Jeff Nichols there on the right, and then they have this kind of cool picture of Black Sabbath here at the top, where you can see Geezer, Bill, Tony, and Ozzy all next to each other. And the picture there actually says, in happier days before the split, Black Sabbath at the country retreat in Wales they used for rehearsals. And then it says which one's which in the picture. It's actually a really cool picture. I've never seen that picture before. I'd be curious if anybody has seen that picture. Is there a color version of that somewhere? I just personally have never seen it. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that article. It's so interesting getting these little snapshots in time of what was going on and the perceptions and how people are saying things. So a couple things. By the time I heard of Ozzy Osbourne, Black Sabbath was at least his involvement with Black Sabbath was gone. I've talked about this before, but the first time I heard of Ozzy, he was a solo artist, and it wasn't until later that I found out that he had played with Black Sabbath. Because when I was introduced to Black Sabbath, it was on the album Heavy Metal, which is a soundtrack for the movie Heavy Metal, where Black Sabbath had done the song Mob Rules. That was the first time I'd ever heard what I thought was Black Sabbath, and it was awesome. You hear that version of Mob Rules, which, by the way, the version of Mob Rules on the Heavy Metal soundtrack is not the same recording as the Mob Rules on the Mob Rules album by Black Sabbath, just if you didn't know that. Anyway, so it was news to me when I found out that Ozzy had been with Black Sabbath. You know, as a young kid, a lot of us were when we were just kind of figuring these things out. But I'd love to hear what you remember from this period of time, if you were into Black Sabbath at the time, the tumult and what you were following and hearing about. And did you see Black Sabbath during any of these early times? And then also, if you saw Black Sabbath during the Dio years, what that was like, those early Dio years, because of course they ended up back together again a couple times, but those especially the Heaven and Hell time, that album to this day is just one of the, in my opinion, one of the greatest things that Black Sabbath put out. It was really cool because Dio, and you can hear the other guys have talked about this before. When Dio came into the band, he just added this new energy. He was a lyricist where Ozzy wasn't so much. And he had a bunch more song ideas, different types of ideas, different ways of presenting them. It was just a different person, different personality, different character. And I think it was Tony Iommi even talked about this, where it just felt like it just kind of, it kicked them a little bit and forced them to be better players and go a little extra, grow beyond where they were at that point. So I actually really, really love the Dio era of Black Sabbath. Anyway, I'd love to hear your feedback on that as well. So of course, please follow the channel, like the video, and leave your comments, and also share this. I bet you, if you like them and like this kind of stuff, somebody else that does too. And if you have a Facebook account or any other sort of social media, or just email, send it to a friend that will also enjoy this. And of course, with that, As always, have yourself a fantastic day.